Yes, so this term brown babies, which sounds a bit strange, but it was coined by the African American press, in fact something called the Pittsburgh Courier. It refers to mixed race children of Black GIs, and in that instance, it was British women, but it was also then European women. I'm Lucy Bland. I'm a professor of social and cultural history at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. The Pittsburgh Courier was a leading African American newspaper, and in February 1949 they have headlines which say the first brown baby to arrive in the USA, and it's someone called Leon Lomax, who I've interviewed, who was adopted by his father, which was very hard for them to do, and he's one of the few. And then this term, brown baby, gets used more widely by the African American press. And I think people now, when they've heard the term, and people who themselves are part of that generation, the children of Black GIs, and they all call themselves that. They all call themselves brown babies. Of the 3 million GIs that passed through Britain, so we're talking about 240,000 to 300,000 Black GIs. So, a sizable number. When Roosevelt was re-elected in 1940, he made a promise to black leaders, because he really wanted the black vote, that he would do certain things. One was that they would desegregate the military, which actually didn't happen until at least 48. But another thing was that they would be represented in the military in proportion of black people in the States, and it was then about 10%. East Anglia, for instance, which is still a pretty white area, the Black GIs came first because they built the air bases. They were not allowed to fly in this country, but they built 70 air bases. They were not allowed to bear arms. They did all the service work. They did all the hard work, actually, the building, the driving, the catering, the cleaning, the maintenance of the planes, etc., etc. So they came first and started to have relationships. And when the white GIs came, were horrified to see that these men were being welcomed actually by the locals. Now, the US Army was a segregated army, and they were very opposed, as were most white Americans, to black and white intermingling. And it's estimated about 75% of the military over here from the States were from the South, where you got Jim Crow laws. And if black men had relations with white women there, goodness knows what happens. All of the GIs had to get permission to marry from their commanding officers, who were invariably white. And they would refuse it if a black GI came forward and said, look, I want to marry my white girlfriend. It was very hard. There may be 1 or 2 cases that a commanding officer did allow them to marry. And in fact, there was nothing written in law against it. But they said, well, back in the States, 30 of what were then 48 states, 30 had anti-miscegenation laws. They said, well, if you go back home, it will be illegal. And if they said, well, my girlfriend's pregnant, we want to get married. I've heard of cases where they said, if you try and go ahead, we'll do you for rape. And they brought their own laws with them. And rape then, in the States, the penalty was either life sentence or a death sentence. And what's so shocking is that there were a number who were hanged. In Shepton Mallet, which was taken over by the Americans, a sort of pretty little Somerset town was taken over, and all the ones that were hanged were black. The British often quite horrified by this segregation. Of course, Britain's was racist as well, but they hadn't seen this blatant kind of racism before. And actually some pubs, wonderfully, put up notices saying, that all the coloured, as they call them, the coloured Americans and locals are welcome, but we don't want those white GIs. That happened in 1 or 2 of the pubs. But actually what subsequently happened in many areas is that they segregated the pubs, and they had dances, a black night, as it was called one night, a white the next. So they tried to segregate them in their leisure pursuits. So children born to black GIs and white women, the estimate is 2,000, but I think it might be more, because more and more people are coming forward and saying that was my father or my grandfather. And it's amazing hidden history. So goodness knows, but at least 2,000. At the beginning of the war, there was estimated to be only sort of 8,000 to 10,000 black people or people of colour throughout the whole of Britain. So really not a very big number. So if you then get 2,000 born over a period of 2-3 years, this is a big increase, at least 20% increase of people of colour. And they're born in very white, geographically white areas, which is, quite something, quite difficult for them. East Anglia, along the south coast, southwest, some in South Wales, some around Liverpool, which obviously has a long black presence, but it tended not to be in those particular areas, some in the north. I found very, very little had been written about these children. I thought it'd be so great to actually hear their own stories. You know, it just expanded and expanded, and it still is. I mean, the book came out 5 years ago, but since then, more and more people keep getting in touch. And it's extraordinary. Some people had told their stories before and had been in the local press, but there were quite a few who told nothing to anybody. I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, they hadn't even told their families their whole history. And it was sort of as if it had been airbrushed out of their lives. And it was very cathartic for them. I mean, quite difficult. There was a lot of tears. So of the children born, I estimate that just over half stayed with their mothers or their grandmothers. Sometimes the grandmothers would step in, because some of the mothers were very young, you know, 15, 16, and said, look, you go and have your life. And the grandmothers could be quite young. They could be sort of, you know, late 30s, 40 or whatever. And I mean, I've interviewed one or two who initially, for the first few years of their life, thought the grandmother was their mother and their actual mother was their sister. And so was that, I mean, that's not just amongst mixed race kids, that was happening all over the place. But of the others, nearly half, they were given up into children's homes for adoption, but very few were adopted, because the adoption societies, before 1948, in the Children's Act, you had private adoption societies, and they wouldn't take what they called half-caste, this awful term, half-caste or indeed black children on their books. They said, oh, they're too hard to place, we don't want them. So, I mean, I have interviewed people who were adopted, there were a few, but not that many. So many, you know, who were in children's homes had their whole childhood in children's homes, which were pretty tough, and a lot of corporal punishment. Not just the punishment, but not having a family. And they were lied to. They were told that their parents were dead often. It's affected some of them throughout their lives, that they haven't really been able to sustain relationships because they've never known what a family was. You know, the experiences varied hugely. So some had very supportive families. Some even had stepfathers that, you know, sort of took them on. But others had stepfathers who were always very cold towards them. Some had no stepfather because if the mother had been married, he would force a divorce or whatever. Some had single mothers. I mean, the majority that were kept were single mothers, and it could be quite difficult. The mothers were abused. I mean, I know cases the mothers were slapped, spat at in the street. You know, there was that real hostility. And it's interesting, I think during the war, you know, these Black GIs, they were allies and they were much more welcoming. After the war, attitudes really changed. Seeing black and mixed race kids, you know, you've been with a black man, there was this kind of antagonism. But some had a good upbringing, because not only did they have supportive families, if they're in a small village where everyone knew them, they were just sort of accepted. And it was only later when they went out into the wider world and, you know, there they faced racism. From the ones who've talked to me about their homes, they didn't necessarily suffer much racism, but they suffered the consequences of being in these homes where there was no love. That was the problem, and they were just felt it was, I think, very harmful. Yeah. So one thing that came up during my interviews was that many of them didn't know anything about their fathers. They had been given misinformation or lied to, I mean, by mothers and grandmothers as well. Oh, can't remember his name, oh, he's dead, etc., etc. And then some had tried to find their father, but they had nothing to go on. And there were real problems, because in 1973, a whole lot of the records were burnt in the States, military records, even if they had a name. And the Americans' military were very difficult about giving details of personnel. That actually changed in 1990, because a group over here managed to force them on human rights issues to be more helpful. But nevertheless, if you didn't have a name, so I said to them, look, you know, actually, why don't you go down the DNA route? Because you might find your father, or at least your American relatives, that way. And they hadn't thought of it. I mean, you know, people weren't really, I mean, I started doing the interviews 2014, hadn't really thought about DNA very much. And the thing about the DNA is, obviously, you only can link up to somebody if they've done it, or if someone in their family's done it. And in the States, what's very interesting is it's particularly ancestry DNA. Quite a lot of African Americans do it because they want to find out which part of Africa their ancestors had come from as slaves. So they're in the books, or, you know, one of their families in the books. So quite a lot of the people who then went down that route have had success. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's detective work, but the DNA is a start of something that's really, really helpful. The fathers are generally dead by this time because, you know, they'll be in their 90s or older even, because now these children born in the war, they're now 79, 80, you know. So they found half-siblings, they found cousins, etc. And there have been a number of wonderful success stories. Some have been quite wary. I mean, you can imagine if someone says, look, you know, I'm your long-lost half-sister or half-brother in your case, and they would say, what do you want? You know, you have to be very careful about how you do this. But on the whole, there's been more successes than failures. So yes, I mean, DNA is extraordinary. I think it's really transforming people's lives as we speak, you know. Still they're finding relatives. And also now that they're meeting lots of other people, I mean, like today, quite a few met at my book launch, and then I have had another get-together in Bristol, and there's a Facebook group that was set up. So, and people are meeting, and they just feel it's really empowering. I think having that commonality, recognising the similarities with other people. I mean, there are differences as well, but there are some real similarities which I think makes them feel they belong more, because that was the common thread. They felt we never really belonged. And then you get people saying to them, you know, get back to where you came from, you know, they're British, for goodness sake. You know, that kind of attitude, which, you know, you still get, of course. And if you meet other people with the same history, it's really empowering.